Hello, and welcome to the Datsusara podcast, where we talk with my favorite people about how to escape suffering and find your true path. I'm your host, Chris Odell. All right, so today we had Clay Routledge, who is a leading expert in psychology, in the psychology of nostalgia and experimental existential psychology. He has published over 75 scientific papers. His work is also regularly featured in a blog that he writes for Psychology Today called More Than Mortal. He's done a couple other pieces too that we talk about in the podcast here. Over for I think one of them was New York Times and a few other places, but interesting stuff. Being that his a lot of his work focuses around the people's experiences with meaning and definition in their lives. I thought he'd be a good guest for the show. So we got into all sorts of different things, everything from the usual questions about how did he get into his profession, and then what he might suggest for people to find meaning in their lives, because he's certainly an expert on that. People who might not might be struggling with that. Also, just whether or not what is the importance of meaning, in whatever form people find that in. Is that something that really helps people get through life and be physically healthy, motivated, all that. He's done some really interesting work clinically in all this, so it's a fun person to talk to with all that. And I have an interest in psychology too, so I certainly enjoyed the conversation. We also get into a little bit of politics and just the state of academia, the educational system in general, because there's a lot going on in that area that's a little bit disturbing, but I think needs to be addressed. So some of you may or may not have interest in that, but I'd urge you to have a listen, because it affects our greater world. Overall, I really enjoyed this conversation. This was a fun one for me. So I hope you guys do too. And this is part of calls that I'm doing now, that I'm kind of remotely recording these and doing YouTube videos simultaneously released as well. However, on occasion, since we're using Skype, you will notice that there's a little bit of dropout now and then, but it doesn't last too long, and I hope it won't detract from what was otherwise, I think, an excellent conversation that I hope you all will enjoy. All right, without further ado from me, here we go.
What would you like to do if money were no object? How would you really enjoy spending your life?
Welcome to the Datsusara podcast.
If you say that getting the money is the most important thing, you will spend your life completely wasting your time. You'll be doing things you don't like doing in order to go on living, that is, to go on doing things you don't like doing.
Okay, so Clay, welcome to the show. And how did you pronounce your last name correctly?
It's Routledge, so
Routledge,
just pretend there's no O.
Got it. All right, wanted to make sure of that. Excellent. Well, yeah.
Yeah, it's the proper British spelling.
Okay, got it. Yep. I've got an odd last name myself with that. We pronounce it Odell, but really there's no apostrophe, so really it would be Odell. But I'm not calling myself Odell. It's not happening. So, so I've got a bunch of questions for you and things I wanted to get into. But first thing I wanted to ask you, because I didn't see, I noticed you'd mentioned that you were a dojo enthusiast on your Twitter. So before, just to keep my jiu-jitsu friends happy, what do you train in? Because I'm suspecting.
Oh well,
so
my background is in American Tang Sudo, which is it's a I guess kind of a variant of Taekwondo or Mudukwon Taekwondo. So I did that for a really long time. I have a second degree black belt in that, and but really over the years I'm kind of a free spirit in this regard. I've gone to different gyms. I've trained Muay Thai. I've done some Kung Fu, American boxing. Your jiu-jitsu friends will be disappointed that grappling is probably certainly my weakest game. So I need to get back in. In on. But I'm generally open to everything. And have trained with a lot of random people.
Yeah, it's good stuff then. That works. Do you have any decent jiu-jitsu gyms near there?
Yeah, we actually have a couple, and we have a place in town that's just like a dedicated MMA gym, and
Cool.
called. I haven't been there, but I know some of the trainers there. And they had somebody that was, I don't know if you remember this guy. He used to be in the UFC. The Scarecrow is like Pablo Garza.
Name sounds familiar.
I
Yeah.
think I said his name right. But anyway, so they've got, some local guys that are really good.
Ah, nice, good stuff. Yeah, it's actually, you can find it in most towns these days. It's interesting to see the spread of especially jiu-jitsu and MMA ever since UFC kind of did its thing. So a lot more options than we had when I was growing up as a kid looking for martial arts. So
Yeah, definitely.
yeah, good stuff. Okay, all right. So now that we've haven't lost that part of the crowd, hopefully, they're a strong
We can
cult,
always
I tell you.
weave that back in randomly.
Yeah, we have to do that. Keep their interest, because every time I start going a little more social or political or philosophical, I think they get a little sleepy. But that's all right. We'll try it out. So what do you do for a living? For those that don't know you.
Well, I'm a social psychologist, and I'm a professor of psychology at North Dakota State University.
Okay. And how or why did you decide on your profession there? What made you get into that?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I was in college, like a lot of students, I changed majors a few times. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. But I ended up taking some psychology classes and thinking, hey, this is really neat. I'm interested in this. And I was particularly interested in the scientific side of psychology, which, maybe things have changed in the last couple decades, but certainly when I was in high school, you didn't get a lot of exposure to psychology. So your view of psychology was that it was ultimately therapy, right? That people who went to psychology wanted to be therapists. And then, you start taking some classes in college, and then you realize, wow, there's an entire empirical enterprise behind this. And that's really what I got interested in trying to use the scientific method to interrogate questions about the human condition. Mm-hmm. And I was really interested in philosophy as well, but I don't know, there was something, something too nebulous about it. And I really was interested in the idea of a more quantitative approach. And I ended up, going to graduate school and studying issues that are very, philosophical in nature, because I study existential psychology. But what I liked about being a quantitative psychologist is I could take these broad ideas and try, of course not perfectly, but do the best I could to use scientific tools to investigate, some of these bigger questions that, aren't easy to approach from any perspective, including science.
Yeah, I like that. I was pretty interested in psychology myself when I first I kind of tested out of high school. But anyway, one of my first classes that I was excited to take in college was my Psychology 101 class. But the teacher was just so, I don't know, I could not. It was. I expected it to be really exciting. It bored me to tears, and it killed me. And it made me so sad, because I was sitting around reading, even like people like Robert Anton Wilson, who kind of dipped into psychology amongst other things, and I loved hearing about it. And then I got to this class, and I went, oh God, I can't do this. But it's one of those paths that my life could have taken that didn't. But I still like to learn about it, because it's definitely an interest.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned that one of your focuses is existential psychology, and what would that entail exactly?
Yeah, so existential psychologists are pretty diverse. I mean, there are certainly existential psychologists who are not quantitative at all, and I can get into the distinction. But I'm what's considered an experimental existential psychologist. So what that means is we try to use, a range of empirical methods, but largely, experimental methods to approach existential questions. So what I mean by existential questions is most of the people who do experimental existential psychology with, these kind of unique questions that our species has about the meaning in life, the nature of mortality, the concept of freedom or free will. And the philosophers have, of course, been interested in this forever, and and there's a lot of really great philosophy about these issues. One thing that empirical psychologists try to bring to the table, as I mentioned before, is to come up with ways to experimentally test some basic ideas about how humans approach these questions. And it's not always easy, but it gives us some sense of trying to get down to the bottom of the human existential condition and what it is about our species that makes us unique.
And you've ran a lab that I think, and I got to understand how this works better, how you run a lab on these things, but your lab uses a wide range of empirical methods to explore cognitive and motivational processes that lead to existential questions and anxieties about death and meaning, and how these questions and anxieties impact mental and physical health, close relationships, people's ability to respect and peacefully coexist with those who subscribe to different meaning-providing belief systems. And so how do you run a lab to how does that work? I'm trying to picture like these odd conversations that you guys set up with like everybody in a little white room or something, or how does that work?
Yeah, so it can be odd, but a lot of times this means we'll bring research participants into the laboratory and we'll run some type of experiment. And so what I mean by that, I can walk you through an example, is participants will come into the lab and we'll a lot of times put them in private cubicles with computers, and we'll say you're going to fill out these questionnaires and perform these tasks on the computer. And then, and if anyone who's filled out a personality questionnaire, for example, would know what I'm talking about, you get on there and you answer all these questions about yourself. And, and then a lot of times what we do to make this process experimental is we'll randomly assign participants to different conditions. So imagine you're sitting in there, you're filling out some questions, some personality questionnaires that seem, pretty typical stuff, like types of things you might get online and fill out just for fun. And then, some people in one condition then are presented with some stimuli. It could be something like reading. A lot of times we'll use, something like having people read a philosophical essay about the potential meaninglessness of life. So imagine you're in this condition and you're asked, hey, we want you to read this essay, and then you're going to be asked some questions about it in a few minutes. You read the essay, which details all the different ways in which humans are cosmically insignificant, how tiny we are in the universe and how short our lives are and all of that, right? And so you do that. And then participants in another condition, they read something else that through pre-testing and, careful consideration, we've tried to make similar in many regards to the more existential essay, in terms of the length and the emotional valence of it. But it's distinct in the critical, along the critical variable, which is it doesn't, attack meaning. It doesn't attack the meaning of life. So, some people are doing that. And then afterwards, everyone, completes a series of tasks or answer questions that allow us to see how people respond to reading one of the two essays. And so we've done things, for instance, like seeing if having people read a philosophical essay about the meaninglessness of life increases their interest in or support for religious beliefs or other types of supernatural beliefs. And the idea is, then we can use statistical tools to test this, right? So the idea is if you bring a bunch of people to the lab and then you randomly assign them to these conditions, then you're able to get some sense of, does being exposed to stimuli that challenge a sense of meaningfulness in life cause people to compensate by investing in certain types of beliefs or structures as a way to restore meaning. So that's just one example. And then you can imagine flipping it, which we've done too, which is we give people information challenging some of their most sacred beliefs that give them a sense of meaning in life, and then we see if that increases some kind of anxiety or distress. And so there's lots of ways you can approach this, but ultimately, the goal is to see if we can, as in the laboratory, using basic experimental controls, set up situations where we can try to get at what's kind of motivating different types of behaviors and different types of beliefs.
Interesting. So through that work, what did you find? Did you find that people really desperately need a sense of meaning, or can someone just be productive and walk through life completely thinking that the human race is a waste caused and we're all going to die and it doesn't matter, but they're going to go on and invent things and do good stuff anyway? Or what it seems to be the case?
Yeah, it's as psychologists will often say, it's complicated.
Yes,
because it's a little bit of both, and it depends on a lot of characteristics related to people's personality and some cognitive dispositions that we've also investigated in the lab. But I'd say, as a general rule, what we find is that people, regardless of whether or not they say they're a religious person or a person that cares a lot about meaning in life, there's a certain part of them that when you challenge the meaningfulness of life, whether they, are explicitly indicating it themselves, there's something about that they find somewhat threatening, and respond to that, not always by believing in the supernatural, for instance, but wanting to believe in something, or at least wanting to have an openness to something. And some of the work we've been doing recently, we just around the lab, it's not a technical term, we call these studies that we're doing the crack the door studies. And what I mean by that is we're not turning, hardcore atheists into believers by having them read essays about the meaninglessness of life. But what we find that we're doing is we're cracking the door a little bit, insofar as that even people who tend to say, hey, I'm a skeptical person, I'm not a believer, when you really focus their attention on potential meaninglessness of life, or you make them think about existentially heavy topics like death, what you find is a little bit more of a willingness to be open to alternative ideas and viewpoints, even ones that aren't necessarily empirically supported. So we've done a bunch of work on belief in UFOs and aliens, for instance, showing that non-religious people, when they are reminded or they think about the potential meaninglessness of life, they become a little bit more willing to believe in UFOs or alien visitors. Right. What seems to be, and this is what we're working on now, what seems to be part of this is we all rely on both intuitive and rational processes, right? There are times in which, say, for instance, you need to go buy a new car. You might really focus seriously on the very rational components of that, right? What's the gas mileage? How much does it cost? What's the trade-in value? You might think about the safety record, and you might put yourself in a rational mindset to do that. And that's how the way when we have to approach these types of questions. But all of us also have times in our lives in which emotions push us a little bit, and that can be very, very healthy too. I mean, anyone who's experienced love or the beauty of nature at some level understands this idea of a more intuitive side. And so what we seem to be finding in our research is when people are thinking about existential issues, that they often privilege the more intuitive side over the more rational side. And it seems to be in part because we find meaning through intuition. In fact, if you think deeply and rationally about things, like the existential essay I told you about, that often makes you feel like things are meaningless, right? It's you kind of rely more on your gut or on your emotions that you feel more meaningful. So that's a little bit of oversimplification, but that kind of is in a nutshell what we've been looking into.
And so does it seem fairly important for humans in general to have meaning just to function, though, overall, would you say?
I mean, it certainly is the case that meaning has been associated positively with a lot of health and well-being outcomes. So just for example, feeling like your life is meaninglessness is a risk factor for, depression and even suicide, risky behaviors, drug abuse.
Mm-hmm.
People who feel like their life is meaningful, even if they're grappling with with mental illness, seem to be more able to recover. And so and we also find that meaning has a motivational power, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if you get up every day and you feel like you have some sort of meaning in life, regardless of whether that meaning comes from a religious belief or just from your own self-described meaning of saying, hey, I've got important things to do today. People are counting on me. I matter. That feeling is motivating, right? If you get up and you have that feeling, then it's easier for you to take on challenges and deal with negative feedback or, experience, like pain and suffering. If you feel like your life has no meaning and there's no purpose and you don't matter, then that's demotivating, right? It's harder to get up and push through, especially in times of stress or challenge. And so there does seem to be a lot of motivational and psychological benefits associated with having some sense of personal purpose or meaning.
I've definitely seen that to be the case in my own life, that's for sure. It's doesn't always fix everything, but it certainly helps. One question that I usually ask people about is, what about somebody, and you may have some insight on this, I think, for someone who's on a current life path where they're sort of suffering, and usually in the context of the show, I talk about, people's career paths where they're working some office job that they hate, let's say, but they don't really know what to do to kind of find more meaning in their life or to, what else they could do. What maybe in your studies have you found a way to help people or what people could do, whether or not it's helping or not, to find meaning in their lives, to get that in them somehow? Or
yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm always personally hesitant to prescribe specific solutions, and for a couple of reasons. One, psychologists have been humbled a lot in recent years by pushing a lot of intervention ideas that are not necessarily validated or strong. And I think part of that issue is because a lot of our work, including my own work, is really about understanding people. And it's easier I'm not saying it's easy, but it's easier to try to understand human nature as it exists than it is to change it. Right? So social engineering is always more difficult than just trying to understand why people are the way they are. Much of my research has focused more on why people are the way they are. Now, that being said, that approach can help you understand things that could work. For instance, and this isn't just my work, but other researchers find that a big source of meaning for most of us is close relationships. Right? We're a social species. We have a real sensitivity towards a belongingness. And so when people feel ostracized or lonely or rejected, they tend to suffer from a whole host of psychological ailments. And so one thing that people, I think, can do, and certainly this isn't a novel suggestion, but it's to really think about, like you were mentioning, you might hate your job, or you might not be satisfied with your current trajectories. To really think about the other dimensions of your life that are important to you and what it is that gives you meaning. I mean, one conversation I think a lot of people have been having in our culture is how we've started to really lose faith and disengage from a lot of the institutions that have historically provided meaning, such as churches and other groups that people have been part of, and people are becoming more isolated and alienated. Now, of course, you can argue, and rightly so, that these institutions aren't always a force for good. Sure. But one thing that we do know is they often are a source of meaning that can connect people who from different walks of lives and outside of their employment, for instance. And so I do think that's an issue we need to focus on, is especially with growing concerns about automation and globalization and these issues that are going to dramatically affect people's work lives, is to think about what is going to make people psychologically healthy and what's going to make them productive members of our society. And of course, a lot of people have been talking about this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely some big issues lately, as everybody seems to be worried that robots are replacing us all. But which is, I don't know. I feel like some of it's a little overblown, but then again, it's something good to be thought about. I mean, if if the world of even like a Bucky Fuller would have come about when he thought it would, I mean, we'd all be sitting around trying to figure out what we were going to do with ourselves, and maybe all become artists or I don't know what. But so it's definitely something to be addressed. And so and by the way, for people who haven't read it, you did a great article on some of this that was in the New York Times called "Don't Believe in God, Maybe You'll Try UFOs," which I thought was a fun article.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was pretty good. And it's interesting because I do know a lot of people who kind of got away from religion and all that since I probably ran in those crowds because I was pretty anti-religious myself for a long time. But it's interesting to see that people do tend to replace it with other things to help them make sense of the world and how things work, even if it's just like even simple stuff like just believing in some sort of a malevolent force that is responsible for all the bad things, and then something that's responsible for the good, and they tend to just do that, which is interesting. But I wonder, how we're going to end up in the long run with if we, I could definitely see, I've certainly seen all the flaws and problems in religion, but it is, like you said, there are some good things that came out of it too, and clearly even just physical health. I think I've seen some of the studies where people who have a strong sense of connection through a church or whatnot group tend to live longer and then are a bit healthier too. So
yeah. No, I think that's an important issue, and it's actually an area I want to study next, perhaps, because a lot of my work has focused on, as I mentioned before, this more intuitive side. And the reason I focused, largely on the more intuitive side is because I think that's intuitive cognitive processes are the processes that are most implicated in meaning. Now, that being said, there's a lot of aspects of religiosity that turns out tend to be more rational than people often think. And I do think part of this is, and maybe we'll touch on this later, I do think part of this is the bias that exists in academia often is historically, and not, this isn't always the case, but oftentimes you see this notion that religious people are somehow inferior, or it's a deficit in intellect, or right. Being smart is being non-religious, and dumb people are religious. And you see this a lot now. If you look close, you see this a lot at a very superficial level, right? But if you actually look closely at a lot of the literature in the psychology of religion, you will see, what you just noted. There are, in fact, a number of very tangible health benefits associated with religion. And so that seems to suggest that there's something more complex going on than just, look at these dumb people who have these simple beliefs, because you have groups like Mormons and Seventh-day Adventists live longer than other people, or who, are less at risk for health problems. And certainly in my own research, we reliably find that higher religiosity is associated with better psychological adjustment. So from that perspective, you could make the argument that it's very rational to have a religious identity, if it's the case that there are clear, tangible benefits to being part of a religious group. So I do think there's some complexities there that warrant more, research, and I hope to get into that myself. And the book I have coming out next year, it's largely more focused on meaning, but I do have a chapter dedicated to the health and the mental and physical health benefits of religion. So that really forced me to think about these issues more deeply.
It's definitely something that I've been paying attention to lately, especially since getting into Jordan Peterson a little bit. I think he's running like a big experiment for you practically. I hear there's even a whole movement called the Christian atheist because he's convinced enough people that maybe there are some positive, at least models and things that you can learn from these stories, if nothing else, from a pragmatic angle, that might be beneficial in your life. And I think one of the interesting things I would like to see separated out and somewhere, or at least studied, to see if it's how much of those benefits, physical and mental, otherwise, come from the communal aspect and the social aspect of being part of a church versus just having a personal spiritual belief and and maybe learning something from all the the mythology and whatnot and applying that in your life, because those might be two independent things.
No, I mean, I touched on that only slightly in that New York Times piece that you referenced, but that is something that from our work, and you always have to be very clear to make this point, and I've sometimes missed it myself, which is our work suggests that people are turning to a wide range of magical and supernatural beliefs in the search for meaning, including things like UFOs. Yeah. We've looked at other things too, like other kind of paranormal beliefs, for instance. But what we haven't found any evidence for is that these beliefs actually effectively provide meaning. And so there's a difference between meaning, the need for meaning, motivating kind of an open search for all sorts of ideas, right? Mm-hmm. Then there's a difference between that and that these things actually work. And I think you're right. And one thing I said in that piece, and this definitely warrants more investigation, is that a lot of these more fringe beliefs lack the historical and social infrastructure that you note. And that could be one reason why you might hypothesize they wouldn't do as good of a job providing meaning, because having a community of like-minded people, or at least a community that shares this journey or this quest with you, is important. And so that's one of the things I'm really interested in. And in fact, I've been getting into studying different kind of fringe groups like transhumanists. There's actually like a church of transhumanism in Florida, and there is some debate within the transhumanist community between the people who are more just like hardcore atheists, who their goal is purely scientific, right? We just want to figure out ways to lengthen and improve the quality of human life, with the ultimate lofty goal of being in actual immortality through uploading our consciousness into the web or something like that. Right. Versus this more spiritual angle that seems to be also growing in the transhumanist community, which is, a lot of the goals of transhumanism and religion are actually very similar. They're about improving life for people. They're about being part of the community. They're about, the biggest question perhaps was grappling with the reality of inevitable mortality. And so you see, or what I've seen is in a lot of movements that are kind of secular in nature, even these kind of techno ones, you ultimately see religious-like thinking and processes creep into them. And I think in part because our, the religious mind that we're equipped with by nature doesn't just change because there's, a new social movement in town, or, because a bunch of people have decided to be atheists. Just like an evolutionary psychologist would say, we're still stuck in this tribal mind, regardless of modern society's efforts to counter that. Right. Similarly, we still have, the processes that, and the art, the scaffolding that, makes us more spiritually inclined. And that doesn't change overnight either.
Along those lines, do you see, I was talking to some friends about this actually last night, it seems like even though we're living in an age of prosperity and relative peace, and a lot of things are very much better, I feel like a lot of different cultures are going through a bit of a I don't know, schizophrenic meltdown or something, or maybe it is just, you know, the tribalism thing where we're kind of we've broken down so many things so fast without having something to replace them with, that people are becoming just kind of polarized and confused, and you know, really they're suffering from, I think, a loss of meaning in a lot of ways. Do you see that, or am I just paranoid, or
No,
or
I
both?
think that, yeah. No, I agree. I think there is a real argument to be made that, especially in the, you know, and you kind of suggested this, especially in the more affluent, you know, safe, you know, Western industrialized world, we seem to be, you know, having more of this crisis of meaning. Now, it might in part be because of, with prosperity and progress comes, you know, in some ways comes more freedom, right? In terms of we have more free time, we don't have to worry so much about food, you know, we don't have to worry about these kind of basic needs in general, you know, of course. And that frees up, you know, bandwidth for thinking about these bigger, more existential questions. And so that might be part of it. The irony of that, of course, is that there seems to be this real struggle between freedom and fear. And, you know, of course, existential philosophers have written about this for a long time as well, which is the more freedom, you know, the more freedoms we enjoy, you know, in our society, the more we kind of venture out and think about these ideas, you know, the more, you know, perhaps fear we also experience, which causes us to sort of retract and, you know, cling to these more tribal identities. And so there always is this real struggle, you know, between, I think, these issues. Now, if you're in a developing country or you have real survival concerns, you might be less worried about these issues. But even still, I mean, there's research suggesting that, you know, having some sense of meaning in life is really important for people who are poor or struggling, because, like, you know, like we noted earlier, that there's motivation. Like, if you get up every day and you feel like my life is hard and life isn't fair and the world is cruel, you could retreat and surrender, or you could identify with something bigger than yourself. So it's not that the search for meaning is a rich person's endeavor, but there might be some unique issues that the more affluent society grapples with than the parts of society that are still struggling to meet basic needs. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, well, definitely. Yeah, I think the more time, you have on your hands, the more leisure it can lead to going into some difficult and sometimes dark places. But so I find the days where I have too much time, but and actually, well, it's worse now. There's social media, because I can easily open up my my Twitter or Facebook feed and be incensed immediately. What is wrong with everyone? So I have to be very careful of that lately. So what's the book that you have coming out? What is that? You said next year sometime?
Yeah, I'm not for. It's I've turned it in. It's in production, I believe. So I don't have an exact release date, but the basic idea behind it is, why do we believe in the supernatural? And where it deviates from other books on the topic is a lot of books have focused, and rightly so, on the kind of cognitive foundation of supernatural beliefs. In other words, like, what is it about our brains that that dispose us towards believing in the supernatural? I touch on that briefly, and some of my research certainly focuses on that. But where I really try to, or what my book really focuses on, is this argument that this cognitive approach, or what some people call the cognitive science of religion, isn't sufficient. Like, it tells us it elaborates on the architecture of these beliefs, but it doesn't necessarily help us understand why people maintain these beliefs as they age, as they go through, developmental milestones. Why we abandon certain magical beliefs that we had as a kid, but not others.
Right.
It doesn't, help us, fully understand why people turn to certain types of supernatural beliefs when they're experiencing distress or suffering. Or why, fully grown people who, aren't religious at all, sometimes, suddenly find religion. Mm-hmm. And so I try to offer a motivational complement to the cognitive perspective. And, a lot of my work is really the juxtaposition of the two, which is you need to understand how people can believe and why. And why they believe, and sometimes those are, sometimes the answer is similar, but sometimes they're distinct. And I'm especially, as we talked about, I'm an existential psychologist, so I really focus on the need for meaning, which I don't think is the only motive by any means that drives supernatural beliefs, but that's the one I'm the most interested in. So that's the book's investigating that, and also tries to go into different directions, because one of my arguments, like the one I made in the New York Times piece, is if we just focus on the traditional view of religion or faith, I think we ignore a good portion of what's going on in people's spiritual lives. Yeah. If you look at any survey or poll, religion's in decline dramatically across the Western world. And people used to say the United States was the anomaly, right? While yet Western Europe became secular, we held on to our religious faith. Mm-hmm. But now, if you look at recent polls, we're quickly approaching, European levels of secularism. Mm-hmm. So that's one take, is that religion's in deep decline. But my argument is that's not really true. That certainly traditional religious identification is down, but these people who are abandoning religion, or at least many of them, aren't becoming like hardcore skeptical atheists. Instead, they're looking for a replacement, or what we sometimes call the substitution hypothesis. They're looking for something else that gives their lives meaning, and they're not just looking for friends or a job or some kind of goal that we know is associated with meaning, but they're looking for something magical, like something big than they can find through kind of empirical reality. And so I kind of talk about different studies and investigate this in different ways, in surprising ways that people. I think you have to be more of a. What I argue is, as a scientist, we have to be more detectives, right? And, so if you're a detective and you bring in a suspect, this is going to seem like a weird comparison, but you bring in a suspect and you say, hey, did you commit this crime? They're probably going to say no. And that's, oftentimes how we approach doing research on psychology of religion. You bring in participants and you give them a questionnaire. It's like, are you religious? Or, how religious are you? These are, they're very face valid self-report measures. And then they can say, well, no, I'm not religious at all. And then you just believe them. So what I argue is, no, like the detective, you don't just believe the person outright. Right. You have to dig a little deeper. You have to come at things from different directions and ask different types of questions and use different types of methods to try to see if there's something that you're missing, some clues that you're missing beyond just I'm not religious. Because, or you could make the argument the other direction too. Somebody might say, I'm a very religious person, and then you interrogate it a little bit deeper, and it seems pretty superficial. So I think that in surveys or these public polls are really important because they give us a snapshot of trends, in terms of church membership and belief in God and things like that. And so I'm a big advocate for these public polls, and they're very informative, but they're not sufficiently diagnostic of the religious mind, I don't think. And so What I'm trying to do in my lab is really try to come at these from different directions. And that's why it might seem weird to be like, hey, why do you study UFOs or ghosts or belief in, the paranormal?
Mm-hmm.
It's not because I care about any of those things, really. It's because I'm trying to, come at people in a different direction to see if, even though they rejected one particular set of, non-scientific beliefs in one particular domain, have they generally done that, or are they open to or more flexible about other types of beliefs that are also not necessarily empirical in nature?
Yes, yeah.
If that makes sense.
Absolutely. I mean, I know if you would have asked me, I don't know, even 5 years ago, but certainly 10 or 20 years ago when I was younger and pretty pissed off at religion after being dragged through 3 or 4 of them. So I would have told you that I was an atheist, but that's really not correct, because I still believed in some sort of interconnectedness and synchronicity and something more akin to the Force, I suppose, and I certainly believe in Obi-Wan Kenobi. So it's there were plenty of myths that I was still going by and using. And actually, my wife was similar. When I first met her, she told me she was Catholic, and I had kind of rules about not dating religious people because I was that pissed off about it. And but as I got to know her more, I remember kind of interrogating her, actually, even on the first couple dates, and like, what do you really believe in, getting down to it? And I went, oh, you actually kind of believe, closer to the Force than you do Catholicism, but you're definitely religious to an extent. So and now I stopped picking on her about all that stuff, but yeah, it is very interesting to see that people tend to have something, and whether or not they want to prescribe it to God or whatever, which so many of us have an allergic reaction just to using the word, which is unfortunate. But well, I think that's really important, though, the point you're hitting on, which is we could all use, because I've certainly been guilty in the past of being kind of ironically dogmatic about certain things that I think are are objectionable. But at the same time, I think that it's important to recognize that a lot of these things aren't simple black and white, right? They're not just I believe in God or I don't believe in God, and in fairness to deeply religious people, there's been this, even among, atheists, there's been a real dogmatism. There's a real history of anti-religious dogmatism that is often, hostile to religious people. Not always, but there's certainly that, I get into this in my book as well. There's this unfortunate conflict often between, atheists and believers, when I think a lot of people have more in common than they realize, but they've just attached themselves to these labels. And one of the things that I'm trying to do in this new book, and I might spectacularly fail, and both religious people and atheists equally think I'm an idiot. And, that's fine. But one of the things I try to accomplish is to say, hey, no, if you underneath the surface, there's a lot of commonality between all of us, regardless of the specific beliefs we have, or or whether we go to church or not, or whether we call ourselves certain things or not. At the core of the human condition seems to be this need to be part of something bigger than ourselves, and to feel like we matter, and to be curious. And that's one thing that I think is often lost as well, is, like you were pointing out, when you were younger, you were mad. And I think a lot of us, had that sentiment as well. But that anger and that hostility can create its own kind of dogmatism that inhibits our ability to be curious. Yeah. I think that's, that can be a problem, and not just in religion, in science too. I mean, you see this in academia, and increasingly so. This kind of dogmatism that's anti-creativity, and it's anti-curiosity, and it's anti-freedom, and it's anti-free speech. As we've seen. Yeah. And
and so this isn't just something that's about spirituality. It's also a problem in science. We need people to be able to be curious and to question orthodoxy and to challenge conventional wisdom. And I do worry that, that we're losing that in a lot of institutions. But, ironically, the one that's supposed to be most tolerant and open to curiosity, which is, academia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And you have there was an article in Scientific American called "We Champion Racial, Gender, and Cultural Diversity. Why not Viewpoint Diversity?" And what do you see as the issue with viewpoint diversity in regards to that, especially in academia, let's say?
Yeah, well, as a lot of people have noted, academia is increasingly unidimensional in terms of political affiliation. So we're seeing more and more left-leaning academics and fewer conservative or libertarian or even really centrist, and especially in the social sciences and the humanities. And that alone, you might say, isn't a problem. I mean, I certainly used to be of the belief that so what, like it doesn't matter what people's personal political beliefs are as long as they do their work professionally and objectively. But that was a little naive, I think, on my part, because personal beliefs can bias our research in meaningful ways, especially when you don't have any dissenting voices.
Yeah.
So I think a really simple example that most people would understand, I think, relates. You can just focus on the individual level, and this doesn't have anything to do with politics or ideology. But imagine I have a theory that I'm trying to promote, and I've invested a ton of time into this theory, right? It's my baby, right? I'm doing this research, and most people would agree that I might be biased about that. As objective as I want to be, it might be hard for me to see the limitations and the vulnerabilities, and I have some blind spots about my work. Mm-hmm. Everyone knows this. This is why we have peer review, for example, right? So other scholars can say, "Hey, Clay, you didn't think about this," or "Your study is biased or confounded in this way," or "There's this alternative hypothesis," or "Here's a real weakness of your design." We rely on that at the individual level, right? And this can be very contentious at times, but it's really, really important. The fight's important. Now, so scale that up beyond the individual to the collective, to the group level. Now, imagine that everyone in the field, or nearly everyone in the discipline, shares the same political or ideological beliefs. Mm-hmm. Now, imagine somebody wanted to study a topic that really touched on or implicated in a meaningful way certain of these beliefs. Mm-hmm. Now, instead of all these other people in the peer review process, or all that are supposed to be the people that keep our biases in check, instead of them doing that job, if they have the exact same biases, then we have a collective blind spot that nobody will notice. And this is demonstrably true. I mean, a number of people. I'm not by any means the only person or the first person, talking about this. A number of people have shown, through careful demonstration, that there's a lot of issues in my field of social psychology, for instance, in which research that, has a ton of, of problems with it, kind of got through with not as much scrutiny as it should have. And so this can happen at every level of the process. And it's especially an issue, I think, in the fields where our social values and beliefs touch the topics we study. So It's not a surprise that this is an issue in the humanities and the social sciences, because those are the fields most closely affiliated with political beliefs, right? Mm-hmm.
And I knew we were going to touch on this a little bit. So do you think that there's also, Jordan Peterson and others have talked about the concern with the postmodernist and neo-Marxist influence on academia. And I know I've got some people I know who are professors at places and go, oh yeah, I'm seeing that it's a problem here. And then I know one or two people who either don't, that's either they've been lucky and it hasn't come to their university, or they don't see it at all, maybe because of their biases. But for those also that don't understand what I was just talking about at all, can you explain that in a I don't know, summarize that a little bit, what those things are?
Yeah, so there is this, postmodern movement, which I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong about the history of this, but I think a lot of it, certainly when I was in college over 20 years ago, so the postmodernist movement was kind of confined to literature and art, and the idea was that these are very subjective areas, and so reality is kind of subjective in a way, or there's more than, there's not a single objective truth. And I don't think that idea should be dismissed entirely, especially in certain disciplines where maybe there is something to be learned from this perspective of, well, there's another way to look at, there's another lens to look at this through. And certainly when I was in school, this was a minority of the people. So you might have an English department where a bunch of people were teaching the classics and taking a more traditional view, and then you'd have one postmodern person that was saying, hey, we should deconstruct this text, for instance. Mm-hmm. And maybe that was fine, get some viewpoint diversity, as we mentioned. Mm-hmm. But what seems to have happened in the last couple decades, at least from my perspective, is this movement has grown at perhaps an alarming rate, and it's gone beyond the confines of the humanities into the social sciences, which I think Jordan Peterson probably agrees with this, which part of the problem with that is part of our approach to studying topics in psychology, or just in general the social sciences, is the search for truth, that there is an objective reality, and it's it might be hard to get at, and human beings are biased and introduce biases. And so we have different lenses and perspectives that we bring to the table. And, no one's questioning that scientists are biased, but this postmodern idea is that science is biased, right? Science is a problem, and so we should just reject the whole enterprise, and that we should focus more on people's subjective lived experiences. Of course, anyone with that's being serious at all knows that that's ridiculous. I mean, in terms of science, right? Like if you're a postmodernist and you're publishing your research, then you're typing your papers on a computer and submitting them electronically through a web portal that relies on the reality of objective truth, right?
Right.
A postmodernist who travels to a conference to tell their colleagues all the ways that reality is a social construct is relying on, the understanding that when they get on an airplane that there are certain scientific rules that will hold true, right, about that nature. So obviously there's these really extreme, ridiculous examples that I think everyone would agree with. But I think that the territory that you see a lot of fighting over is they want to argue that certain social phenomena or issues in the social scientists aren't really in that scientific camp. They're in this more humanities, subjective, lived experience camp. And I just don't think that's a constructive way to go forward either, because if we can't agree there's a ground truth or a reality that's worth interrogating, then all you have is a bunch of people fighting over their lived experiences and their opinions, and I'm just not sure how that's helpful. And I think the other issue that's happened alongside this postmodern movement is its use in a more moral or almost religious way, and that is, if you say, well, this is a scientific question, what is the evidence? Their argument is, well, that's you're rejecting my lived experience or my personal testimony with your objective truth, and that's hurtful. And this is the whole words are violence kind of argument, and it's used as a weapon against debate, right?
Yeah.
Because you're trying to say, hey, I want to ask this empirically, and they're saying, your empirical approach is oppressive,
Mm-hmm. Right.
and you need to listen and believe as one of the tools, that we've heard with these like kind of autoethnographic, postmodern methodologies, and I just don't see how that is going to help us at all understand the human experience or human nature, or help any of the groups that postmodernists are supposedly, deeply concerned about. And so I think that is an issue. And one thing, that has surprised me about it is how fast this has grown and how it's contaminated all sorts of disciplines that I think would otherwise be purely scientific. There seems to be some sympathy for this postmodern approach. And I think a lot of it has to do with this political bias on the far left too.
Yeah. And definitely, I think just and the whole notion of sympathy and that people, and virtue signaling and all that, I think it comes from a place of kindness where people want to say, hey, don't hurt this person, don't make them feel, marginalized, don't do all these things. But in being a little too nice, I think people get misled, and then, they start exactly attacking it almost like a way a religious person would, and letting, they don't even want to let you speak about it or have a discussion.
Yeah.
And it destroys our common language. I mean, you have to have some sort of limitation or common, interpretation of things in order to, make use of, to move along practically in the world. To have these things, have progress and have a computer work, all these other things, we need that.
Yeah.
So what do you see as the way, the way out of this, or how does this get, pushed back or stopped, at least, so that it's not halting all progress?
I mean, that's a tough question, and it depends on the day and how cynical I feel.
Yeah.
I mean, there are times when, and this is by no means a positive outcome, but there are times where I think the whole system will just self-destruct because, and by the system I mean our academic institutions,
Right.
Because like anything, any idea that is out of touch with reality or crashes against reality eventually is revealed.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, things just you won't I made a joke one time that there's no postmodernist in oncology wards. I mean, if you get diagnosed with cancer, you're going to go listen to the medical experts. You're not going to listen to a postmodernist who says that disease is a social construct.
Yeah, right.
So I mean, I think so. That's my worry, is that the more our academic institutions capitulate to the demands of the postmodernists, are overly sympathetic to them and increasingly police, debate and discussion and research, the more they will just become irrelevant to broader social discussions and research. And I mean, you can certainly imagine more and more think tanks developing where people start to privately fund research or to come up with alternative. I mean, humans are clever, right? We're creative, and we're industrious, and we will, if something's not working, we'll and especially in a free market, we'll move on, and so that's my concern. I mean, we've already seen some polls and surveys suggesting that young people, particularly young men, are losing faith in universities, or losing the belief that that has been held for a long time, that colleges are a good investment. College is a good investment. Part of it is because it's getting increasingly expensive to go to college. And part of it, I think, is, people, there's so much access to information and different ways of approaching, of approaching education, that people are, starting to think, is this really worth it? So that's right. My most cynical side is, will we just render ourselves completely irrelevant because other ways of of approaching these questions will move forward, why we refuse to compete in that environment.
Right.
So I hope that's not the case. I mean,
Sure.
I'm a university professor.
Be changing
I
jobs,
guess I have yeah, exactly. And to that point, there are, and this is why I worry about the lack of viewpoint diversity too. There's a lot of really smart, conservative, and libertarian thinking people that, have a lot to contribute, and may feel pushed out or unwelcome in academia, and they might just not do anything related to these issues, which would be a shame because they might have something to contribute. But a lot of them might go work for think tanks or come up with different ways of contributing to the discussion of these cultural issues, and so that's a concern. But as far as other ways to deal with it, I think that as universities, we're going to have to have honest discussions about what's our mission, and is it our mission to be the political arm of the Democratic Party? Or the research arm of the Democratic Party? Is it our mission to give out degrees in social justice? Is it our mission to be the new church? I don't think any of those things are good missions. It should be our mission to pursue the truth, to have an open place for intellectual exploration and education, and I think that's going to mean recommitting ourselves to academic freedom, to viewpoint diversity, and to the idea that anyone can, that people shouldn't be afraid of ideas or feel threatened by ideas, and a real rejection of this kind of safe space culture and this postmodern movement, and say, hey, nothing's off limits, and the university is the one place that people should be able to go to pursue ideas and to pursue the truth. And I don't know what it's going to take to recommit ourselves to that, but I don't think on the whole we're going in the right direction right now.
Doesn't seem to be. I even saw a very, very pro-atheist professor that I know here in Portland complaining that he's like, man, I thought the religious right was a real problem, but now he's watching the far left just kind of taking over and and kind of destroying, going after the truth, not letting people do research, that sort of thing. So he's
pretty sure I know who you're talking about. Too.
Yeah, Peter. Yeah. So
yeah,
it was interesting to see his comment there because I'm like, oh, he hates religion, but it's but yeah, still notice that. It's interesting.
Well, I think it's worth noting that a lot of the people that are, that were very prominent atheists, I don't think it's a coincidence that they're the ones, or many of them are the ones that have so quickly identified the religious-like nature of this modern social justice movement.
Yes. Because
they've spent so long thinking about, the dimensions of like this kind of religious fundamentalism that they can spot it.
Yeah.
And I think people like Peter and others are, the reason they were quick to spot it is because they knew what they were looking for, because they were thinking about, they'd been thinking about these issues from another perspective for a long time.
Yeah, it's a different face. Some of this stuff reminds me of I'm sure there's got to be some connection to, in some ways, maybe to the loss of religion, though, ironically, with all that, because it reminds me of almost talking to like a New Ager kind of person, where the same thing, they might, oh, it's not a cancer, man, you just need to think it away or something, and they're gonna.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting thing.
And I think I always try to figure out a way to say this in some manner that doesn't seem, insulting, because I don't mean it to be, but I think it's an uncomfortable truth that part of the issue too is in some of these fields that have embraced postmodernism, there's been a real drop in the standards of what counts as scholarship. If you follow the Real New Peer Review on Twitter, for instance, you get to see it. Now, we can't condemn, and the reason I'm really careful about this is there are people in the humanities doing very, very rigorous and difficult and painstaking work. So you can't, we can't paint them all with the same brush.
Sure.
But if you look at this postmodern kind of movement, you can get a peer-reviewed publication for writing essentially a diary entry about your lived experience. And if you sprinkle in enough of the postmodern critical theory jargon, you and make it sufficiently neo-Marxist, it passes as scholarship. And a lot of this stuff, if you just read it, it doesn't matter what your personal opinions are about postmodernism. I mean, if you just read it, you would know, like, it's pretty low quality. And so there are fields, I think, in the academy that have, unfortunately, I don't know if it's virtue signaling or if it's just the groupthink or ideological bias that, people are hiring and recruiting people doing substandard work because they're doing the right type of work, right? They're doing the pro-Marxist, anti-capitalist, intersectionality work, and it's not about the quality of that work, right? It's just that they're doing it from the right theoretical perspectives, and that should worry us, because regardless of what you think about any of these theories, I mean, you should be worried about the rigor and the quality of the research. And it's embarrassing. I mean, it's embarrassing to academics. I know a lot of people that are spend a lot of time in graduate school, and they're very, very well-trained, sophisticated scholars who have a hard time getting academic positions because they're so competitive. And these publish these postmodern journals, and you look at some of the institute, some of these scholars, sometimes, not always, but sometimes, and you really have to wonder about that. Like, how can somebody who's writing basically diaries about themselves be at these institutions where people are doing very, very rigorous work in other departments?
Yeah. And I think, too, and the more even from the general public side, the more you see things like that, come out and make it through peer review and all that, it kind of erodes everyone's, I suppose, faith in science in some ways, or because they look at that and go, well, see, it is all just bullshit, and why should we, take it seriously? So it kind of actually feeds into itself that way. It just erodes everybody's, confidence and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think so. And I mean, we've always had an issue with, it's a lot of times ideas that are in fact, or research that is in fact important. It's, we've always had this issue of, it's real easy for somebody like a politician or someone in the media to read an abstract and make fun of it and say, hey, this is stupid, without really understanding anything about the work, of course. Sure. And so, we do have to, I think, be mindful of that. Sometimes people who don't have any expertise to critique something are critiquing it. But at the same time, you're right. I mean, this is why I said anyone can read. There's a lot of scientific articles, of course, that, even someone who's really trained in one field couldn't understand from another field, right? Because it's so technical and it involves methodologies and knowledge that are very specialized. But anyone can read these postmodern papers and realize that this is just not very hard. Regardless of what you think about these theories, I mean, this is not, someone didn't go out and collect a large sample, diverse sample of people, a random sample, with high statistical power. They're not even using statistics, right? They don't even believe in statistics. Sure. So you can, and so when the public sees that, you're right. I mean, it just seems like, well, what, and a lot of these people work at public institutions, of course, which are taxpayer funded. So you have people thinking, well, why am I paying this person to write about, their neo-Marxist pet theories by, talking about their personal lived experiences, and they're not doing really, really rigorous scholarly work. And so I do think that hurts our reputation. Sure.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how things end up. I know a lot of people are, playing around with online universities and different things. I I think the unfortunate part about that will be similar to maybe the unfortunate part about what you would lose in not having, a church that you go to. You're going to lose a little bit of that social interaction aspect to learning. And even though I didn't really, I spent very little time in college myself and was kind of off on my own. I think it would have been beneficial to have more of that experience, and it's nice to think that people can still go and get a well-rounded education and be exposed to different things and ways of thinking and all that, but we're kind of losing that. So it's going to be interesting to see where it ends up.
Yeah, I agree. It will be interesting, and I'm along for the ride, I guess. But I try to be, I try to be hopeful, but like other people, like Jordan and of course Peter and many others. I mean, I think there are real warning signs that, and you mentioned this too, that a lot of people seem to either don't know these issues exist or don't believe that. I think the biggest response that I've seen is not an outright denial that there's this weird postmodern social justice movement, but more of you're exaggerating, right? It's not that big of a deal,
right? And
there's a real sympathy to it. And what I always try to tell these people, and they don't like, I was like, well, imagine if we had a department at the university in creation science, right? And we had this whole department that was dedicated to, the Earth is less than 10,000 years old, and and we realize that there's all this evidence that it's not the case. But why should we believe that evidence? It's part of this secular patriarchy that's anti-religious. I mean, you could imagine using all the exact terminology that postmodernists use against science.
Yeah.
You could imagine religious people using that. Now, how tolerant do you think my colleagues would be of this small, Christian Science department in my public university, right? Do you think they would, oh, they're fine, they're not that big of a deal? Or do you think they would be bothered by the fact that they're teaching students, right? That students are going through their classes and being told, hey, don't trust your biology professor, don't trust these people because they're teaching you, this oppressive form of knowledge, and we're going to reveal to you, these more subjective lived experiences. And so I think anyone who is a critic of, the New Earth kind of Christian right should be equally criticizing the postmodern academic left. But of course you don't really see that issue.
No, it's in fact just bringing it up. I've found that when I try and bring up any of these issues to the vast majority of my friends or people that I've known online, I immediately get called some sort of conservative right-wing crazy person who's shaking his fist at the clouds, and I'm going, guys, I'm pretty, I'd say at best probably a classical liberal, or I lean socially libertarian, but I'm definitely, even though I'll take good ideas from any side that they come from, but I'm definitely, I used to be someone who would sit around and I liked The Daily Show and Colbert and John Oliver and all that, and I like it less now because I see what some of the things that are that could be a problem in the way that we attack things, and it's unfortunate because I think it opens the door. These bad tactics and ways of restricting the pursuit of truth, they're going to be a problem. Maybe on the side of the left now sort of go, oh, that's fine, but they don't realize that those same things could come back around from the right, the stuff that we people have been fighting forever, the religious right thing, the censorship that I remember even in the 80s and from all of that, but people don't see it, or they don't want to see it. I don't know. I've gotten frustrated just trying to even get the word out because it's people will just attack you outright with those tools. They'll start naming you and labeling you and telling you that you're not, you're being cruel to marginalized people or whatnot, when that's not the point at all.
Yeah. No, in fact, I try to tell people that no, if you really believe in helping people, especially disadvantaged groups, then the idea shouldn't be to hide from facts or to reject sort of empirical tests of, these theories and these ideas that people like. It should be to really get to the bottom of them, because how is it helpful to anyone? Use the example of medicine. Would it be, say I came up with a new medical treatment for, a prominent illness, and it was from a place of wanting to help people, right? I just want to help these vulnerable people, and so I'm gonna try to, give as many people this medicine as I can. And well, what if it doesn't work, right? And what if people said, hey man, I don't think that therapy you're using is working, and I was like, hey, why are you being so prejudiced? I'm just trying to help these vulnerable people. That's what's going on at some level. It's like it doesn't make questioning the scientific truth of something, or wanting to really investigate or debate something, doesn't mean that you're against anyone who's the supposed person who benefits from that intervention, right? And I think that's been lost too. Like you say, I would consider myself pretty classically liberal in many regards. I would guess centrist is another word. I'm just interested in ideas from all sides. Some of some of my beliefs would probably align me as more conservative. Some of them would align me as more liberal for certain. I've never registered with a political party just because I consider myself independent. And I personally don't really care what if someone is a Republican or Democrat. I'm interested in ideas. But even saying this kind of stuff, like your experience, people have called me right wing or alt right or all sorts of it's weird how you could just be curious. Just even being curious is now a crime to not all but many on the far left. And I think what they don't realize perhaps is that actually drives people towards the right. Because you and I might feel comfortable just being like, hey, I don't fit in anywhere, whatever, we're weirdos. Right. But there's a lot of people that want, they want allies, right? Humans want to belong. And so I think there's a lot of people that'll say, hey, if you're not going to give me space, if liberals aren't going to give me space to be curious about these ideas or ask these questions, and people on the right will, I guess that's my new tribe. Because these people, and I've seen that on college campuses. I think there's a big difference between the old guard on the right, which people in the media often talk about, the old conservatives. There's a big difference between them and these young people on college campuses. These young conservatives or young, college Republicans seem to be much more socially open-minded, non-traditional, welcoming to different groups. And I'm speaking in generalities, of course, but you're seeing that become more of the kind of the alternative or kind of cool kids. Like, this is the space you can say politically incorrect things, or you can explore different ideas. And the campus left seems to be the more, again, this is just an oversimplification, but seems to be the more authoritarian, moral policing. You can't say that, you can't think that, you can't ask that. It's it's a weird flip. Definitely among young people, I see this more and more. And so I don't think liberals realize the extent to which this is happening amongst young people, and how people are being pushed towards the right simply because of their intolerance. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I never thought it would be a rebel move to move to the right, but it seems that way these days. It's it's unfortunate, tearing people apart a little bit, but. Yep, interesting problems of our times, I suppose. So, yeah. Again, we'll see where. Fascinating, worrying, but also fascinating. yeah, definitely. Hope we all come out of it for the better eventually here, and I'm glad you're doing the work you're doing and getting the word out. And I think you're part of a team of people in pursuit of the truth and making things better. So, I appreciate that. Well, I appreciate you saying that. Yeah, I thought that, when I was in college, I that's what I thought. Like, this is where the university is where, it's to use the safe space,
Yeah.
the safe space idea that people always talk about. And I think that's the great irony, is I always thought universities were a safe space in the sense that they were safe for any idea, right? Yeah. You could say the craziest stuff, and you might be wrong, and you might be humiliated, and people might, and that's fine, right? That's part of it. That's part of the battle of ideas, is you put yourself out there and you learn and you make mistakes, and that's intellectual exploration. And so it really is sad to me that that's increasingly less the case, that it's not a safe space for ideas. It's a safe space for people's feelings. And people's feelings are often the opposite of freedom, right? Like, if you're fear focused, that's the enemy. Fear is the enemy of freedom. And if you're constantly worried that you're going to offend somebody or hurt somebody's feelings, and nobody gets to talk about anything, and then you don't truly get to investigate ideas, and that's a real shame. We have too many pressing problems in our world to take that type of approach, and it's doing a disservice not just to us and to young people, but to future generations that need us to kind of toughen up and tackle these issues head on.
Yeah, agreed. Well, I'm going to be sensitive of your time here. I'm sure you've got professoring to do, and so.
Sure, why not?
but how can people find out more about you? What's the best way for them to take a look at your work?
Oh, good question. Yeah, so I have a website. I think it's just clayrutledge.com. And I need to update it, but I try to put things on there. I do, of course, I'm a scientist, so I do research, but as you know, I do a lot of writing for the public. I mean, that's something that I'm really interested in, is trying to make these ideas accessible to people. You can follow me on Twitter, of course. I'm on there putting,
Yeah.
Is out. But yeah, I think those are probably the main ways to find me.
Excellent. All right. Well, and I'll probably have you back on sometime if we get a chance. I have a few questions I didn't get to, but that was a great conversation, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. All right, so that was our conversation with Clay Routledge. I hope you have enjoyed this episode of the Datsusara podcast. As always, you can find out more information about the show at dspodcast.com. You can help support the show, but it is not necessary because I also own a company called Datsusara, where we sell all sorts of gear from mostly hemp-based. Things from everything from apparel to duffel bags, backpacks, towels, hoodies, more, all that stuff being antimicrobial, breathable, strong, and sustainable, being the properties of hemp there. We even now have some soap and hemp protein powder, all that stuff. We're a little bit hemp happy over there. Go check it out. Oh, that's at DSGEAR.com. Sorry guys, I'm a little bit off because we're now doing the video version along with all this, and it's probably making me slightly self-conscious and distracted. So don't worry, I'm gonna get better at it. And if you want to find out more about me personally, check out my Twitter feed, which is at DatsuChris, or you can track me down on other various social media outlets. All right, thank you for joining the conversation. Be seeing you.
Better to have a short life that is full of what you like doing than a long life spent in a miserable way.